Now we come to the book prize.
Books take longer.
Yeah, well, what will they do when I'm even if we didn't say as much to each other, I think the idea we had of the shortlist was that it would, that each of the ones, each of the books on the shortlist, each of the books on the shortlist would make a winner that the four of us would be proud of, if by some mischance the rest were pulped by some great clanking fist. So I'll go through them, but first of all I'd like to say there were a couple of other books, in fact more than a couple, on the 200 that we were sent, which are certainly worth mentioning, could have been on any other shortlist. There's Hitler's Empire by Mark Mazur, which elaborates and compares the varied agonies of the lands that the Nazis conquered and occupied and those that they didn't occupy. And it supplies a kind of missing chapter, really, to the history of those years, and one which reverberates to this day, and I thought it was absolutely fascinating. I must mention, too, the recently departed from the platform, Patrick Cockburn, Muqtada al-Sadr and the Fall of Iraq, which is a subtle and absorbing report, just as subtle and absorbing as his newspaper reports of the conflicts within the Shia community, and conducted, one has to say, under conditions of extreme intermittent danger to the collector. And that would certainly be a contender if Patrick hadn't already wrong-toned the journalism category, so we thought we couldn't sort of overload it, we're honest. And finally, before I get on to the short list, I would like to mention Philippe Sands' Torture Team, which describes in minute and damning detail how the lawyers in the Department of Defense and elsewhere in the American military bureaucracy were corrupted by Bush's abrupt tearing up of the Geneva Conventions, and how those who would not be corrupted were cast out of the loop. It's a perfect anatomy of a fish rotting from the head, and one that's familiar in these waters too, in Britain. I think all these books would have appealed to Orwell for their exactness of reporting and their zest for significant fact and their clarity of style. And I hope the same is true of the 6 we eventually chose. Owen Matthews, in Stalin's Children, recounts the fates of 3 generations of the Bibikov family. Boris, the punctilious commissar who disappeared in the purges, the appalling hardships endured by his daughters, one of whom they married a young British diplomat, against relentless opposition in the Cold War. There's a cause célèbre at the time, which I'm just to remember, Mervyn Matthews trying to marry his Russian bride, which in the end he did, and produced the author, who in turn became a correspondent in Moscow and revelled in the hedonism of the post-communist era. So there's sort of 3 generations paralleling 3 tiers in the history of 20th century Russia. It's a very difficult thing to bring off, this interweaving between public and private, and I think that Owen Matthews manages it with great brio. Another side of the Orwellian legacy, if you like, is the long reflective essay on contemporary themes and episodes, which is rather a species that is presently endangered. I can imagine if Lord Macaulay were here today, I can imagine a publisher turning him down and saying, "Sorry, Tom, it's just a collection of essays." And so we particularly felt the need to celebrate the achievements of Tony Judd, the master of the form on both sides of the Atlantic. In reappraisals, there's an irresistible kind of ease about the way he leads you through whatever the issue may be, in his case, the fall of France, Blair's Britain, and makes you murmur, yeah, that's how it is. And then suddenly you find yourself rather surprisingly landing up at a destination you haven't quite expected, but which is unarguably the right one. Then complete contrast, but also very Orwellian, is the Hsiao-hung Prize, I'm not about your pronunciation, first book, Chinese Whispers. It's the story of how she, as a young Chinese woman, went undercover to join Britain's hidden army of illegal immigrant workers, mostly but not all Chinese, from the cockle pickers of Morecambe Bay and the onion pickers of Evesham to the waiters in West End restaurants. It's a modern, globalized version of Down and Out in Paris and London, with the working conditions twice as nasty. The book has sort of awkward edges, which for a first book you might expect, but it only makes the individual stories she has to tell more harrowing, and she could have chosen as her epigraph those unforgettable words from the road to Wigan Pier, which when I was at TLS I always used to murmur to myself, "You and I and the editor of the Times Lit Sun, and the Nancy Poets, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, all of us really owe the comparative decency of our lives to poor drudges underground, blackened to the eyes with their throats full of coal dust, driving their shovels forward with arms and belly muscles of steel." Well, that's Chinese whispers in a new form. There were quite a few books submitted to us which dealt in one way or another with the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've already mentioned Patrick Cockburn, but I'd also like to refer to David Lloyd's Butcher and Bolt, which is a compelling up-to-this-minute history of foreign involvement in Afghanistan. Alas, it was inadmissible because David's just been joined the Council, of the Media Standards Trust, which is the board, which is one of the partners of the prize. But the most impressive account of these entangled tragedies is Ahmed Rashid's Descent into Chaos, which is an intricate but indispensable account of the war against Islamic extremism spilling over those all too permeable borders between Afghanistan and Pakistan to finger the real villains of the piece. Just how indispensable it is you can judge by the fact that it seems to me this is the airy way in which Obama's new AFPAC policy exactly seems to be modelled on Rashid's diagnosis. And I think after reading it one feels possibly wrongly that for the first time you've really got a handle on the problem. Now we come to the last two. Descent into Chaos opens your eyes in just the same way as Mark Thompson's history of an earlier conflict. The White War is a history of the Italian front in the First World War. A front which has been rather eclipsed until now by the horrors of the Western Front, but where the casualties were just as devastating, the conditions just as unbearable, and the generals just as stupid and sadistic, probably more so. It's a marvellous book which manages the perfect balance between narrative and analysis, picks up the unfinished business of the Risorgimento, and helps to explain both the rise of Mussolini and the incoherent state of Italian politics today. When I finished reading The White War, I thought it would be very hard to beat. But when I came upon Andrew Brown's Fishing in Utopia, I was quite simply entranced. And so I was delighted to find were my fellow judges. The book tells in a style which is both charming and crystalline and deceptively simple the story of how the author fell in love with Sweden and everything Swedish, including his first wife, the fishing, and the socialism. More particularly, the spirit of equality which seemed to pervade the whole country, and which he found a refreshing contrast to Britain. And when he falls out of love, it isn't just a straightforward disillusionment, a God that failed, but rather a rueful recognition of how incredibly hard it was and is for any country of dirt-poor farmers to emerge into an industrial nation without losing some of its innocence in the affluence. The descriptions of fishing are as enchanting as anything since Isaac Walton, but in its light and easy way, the book is as profound as it is enchanting. And so we have really very great pleasure in awarding the Orwell Prize for 2009 to Andrew Brown.